Picture something a lot of teachers have run into this year. Student submits a paper, you read it, something feels off, or maybe nothing feels off, and that's exactly the problem. It's smooth, well organized, it's grammatically clean. You run it through an AI detector. The result comes back inconclusive, or worse, it flags a piece of writing you're fairly sure the student actually wrote. You're stuck. Hello, and welcome to another episode of AI in the Classroom Daily, a podcast helping educators make sense of AI without the hype. I'm Dan Cogan-Drew, and I use AI as a thinking partner in preparing each of these episodes because I think the best way to talk honestly about AI in education is to work with it openly. AI detection tools have a well-documented reliability problem at this point. We've talked about this on this show. The false positive rate, flagging a real student's writing as AI generated, has made them more trouble than they're worth for a lot of teachers. So today we're going to talk about what teachers are doing instead. A teacher named AJ Giuliani has been sharing one answer, and it recently caught the attention of Kim Marshall, whose Marshall Memo, a weekly digest of research and practice that principals and coaches have been relying on for years, flagged it as worth attention. That's not a small thing. Marshall has a track record of identifying classroom-level solutions that are actually working, and not just generating chatter online. So the approach is disarmingly simple. When a student submits a paper, you take that paper, run it through an AI tool, and ask it to generate a 5-question comprehension quiz. The next day, every student gets that quiz on the paper they supposedly wrote. If you did the work, researched the topic, made choices about what to include, drafted and revised, etc., you'll pass easily. You lived with that material as you were developing your writing. If you submitted something you didn't write, though, you probably can't answer basic questions about what's in it. So that's the approach. I want to suggest that the quiz is actually the least interesting part of what that opens up, because the questions it's asking, do you actually know this, turn out to go much further than a 5-question multiple choice quiz. A teacher and writer named Nick Potkolitsky has been thinking carefully about the language educators use when they worry about AI in student work. Specifically the word ownership, as in students should own their learning, own their thinking, own their work, and so on. His argument is that ownership is the wrong metaphor, not because the concern behind it is wrong, but because ownership carries a logic that quietly shapes how we respond to the problem. Ownership implies a transaction. You either have it or you don't. Before you didn't have it, and after you do. Now, if that's the frame, then the natural response to AI is detection. You're trying to catch the moment the transaction is being faked. But here's what AI has made impossible to ignore. A student who uses AI to generate an essay has acquired the essay in the most literal sense. They have it. They can read it, submit it, put their name on it, but something obvious is missing, which is exactly why the quiz catches them. What's missing, Potkolitsky argues, isn't ownership, it's formation. His claim is that learning isn't a transaction, it's a process, and that process moves through at least 3 distinct kinds of cognitive work. Now, to be clear, this is his synthesis, not a named research framework, but I think it draws on learning science in ways that are worth taking seriously. So the first is retention. Can you hold what you encountered? Can you carry it forward without the source in front of you? Memory research, including the work of cognitive scientist Robert Bjork, has long established that being able to retrieve information without a crutch is a meaningful marker of learning. The quiz is operating at this level. A student who worked through the material is going to pass, one who didn't probably won't. The second is transfer. Can you take what you know somewhere new, explain it in a different context, apply it to a problem that you haven't seen before? This is what teachers are doing when they ask a student to teach the class what their paper was about. It requires a kind of flexible understanding that doesn't come from receiving information. It has to be constructed. I'll note here that the research on transfer is actually more complicated than it sometimes gets presented. Some researchers have argued that genuine transfer is rarer and harder to achieve than schools tend to assume. But the distinction between being able to answer questions about a paper and being able to explain its ideas to another person is real, and any teacher who's tried both knows the difference. Now, the third is agency. Can the student act from what they know, form a position, defend it, revise it under pressure? Potkolitsky is careful to say this isn't purely a cognitive level, it's a disposition, and it develops through the experience of having generated something yourself, committed to it, and then revised it when challenged. This connects to what's called the generation effect in memory research, the well-supported finding that students who produce their own thinking before receiving outside input are in a different position than students who don't. And the framing here is worth quoting, so I'll quote it. Students who generate before they delegate carry something into the AI interaction that changes its character entirely. Without that prior generation, AI doesn't augment thinking, it replaces it. That probably sounds familiar because we've talked in earlier episodes about the cognitive surrender research from the Wharton lab at UPenn, the finding that The one intervention that meaningfully reduced surrender was when participants had a genuine stake in their own accuracy. That's the same idea approached from a different angle. The student who has already generated their own thinking has something to protect. The student who hasn't has nothing to check the AI against. So where does this lead in practice? We discussed before on this podcast the work of educators building custom bots for specific classroom purposes, including an episode where I walked through a bot built by educator Amelia King designed to help students reflect on their own AI usage. One natural extension of that experimentation is a bot built not to catch a student, but to probe their understanding of the paper they say they wrote. Ask them to explain their argument, push back on a claim, ask them what they'd revise and why. That's close to an oral examination than a plagiarism check. This isn't the norm in classrooms right now, but it's a direction that teacher experimentation is beginning to move, and it's worth watching, especially as we see practices like AJ Giuliani and the teacher that he observed are engaged in, and we think about how they're going to scale from administering a quiz to every student to asking students to teach the class. There simply aren't enough minutes in the day. We're going to need to figure out ways to address this on a more individual level in a scalable mechanism. And bots could be the answer for that. So what are the practical takeaways? For classroom teachers, the quiz is a legitimate starting point, and I think it's worth trying. If you run the paper through an AI tool, generate 5 questions, you can give the quiz the next day. But I'd urge you to think of it rather as a floor rather than a ceiling. If you look at your existing assignments and ask where students actually has to be present in their own thinking, where they have to explain, defend, or do something with what they know, that's the moment that we should be building deliberately and protecting. For instructional coaches, Potkolitsky's framework, I think, is a useful lens when you're reviewing assignments. You can ask where they are on the spectrum from retention to agency and where the task is actually operating. I think you'll find that most tasks probably bottom out at retention, and sometimes that's fine, but it should be a conscious choice that is being made, not just the default. And for district leaders, I think the teacher ingenuity here on display is happening without a policy directive or a product rollout. The quiz approach, the peer explanation, early work on classroom bots. Teachers developed these because they needed to solve a real problem and didn't wait for someone to tell them how. And I think that's a question worth asking, is whether the professional learning structures are giving teachers space to share and refine what they're finding. So Potkolitsky's reframe is worth carrying out of this episode. He writes, formation is a better word than ownership. You are not the same after genuine learning as you were before. You see differently, reason differently, act differently. This is what the work is for. And I think if that's the standard, then the question changes from did the student write this to did doing this change the student? And I think the second question is much harder to answer, but it's probably also the right one to be asking. So I'd love to hear from you on this. What do you think of AJ Giuliani's approach? Have you tried it yourself? Have you created a quiz based on students' own work and then given them a quiz on that work? Could that become part of the process by which they are creating their own writing and certifying to you that it is theirs? As always, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.